Hey everybody, this is Jamie Madigan, and I'm here in my home office today answering some questions for the Games and Interactive Media course at PSU. So thanks for writing in. I got a list of questions here from your professor and your TA that I'll just kind of go through and tackle one by one. Keep it real informal, and pardon any flubs or false starts. But the first question asked me to kind of introduce myself. My name is Dr. Jamie Madigan, and my background is that I am an industrial organizational psychologist. I have a PhD in that field, and I've worked in that field for about 20 years at this point. And if you're not familiar with industrial organizational or IO psychology, the shortest definition that I like to give is that we make work suck less. We use psychology to do that. If you want to get a more detailed definition, you can, I'm sure, find it out there on the web. I currently work at a company called LeaderAmp.com that uses artificial intelligence and IO psychology to help people develop into better managers and better business leaders. And I also do the psychology video game stuff on the side, which is kind of why I'm here, I imagine, talking to you now. So I started doing that back actually in 2009. I started a website at psychologyofgames.com just because I'd been doing a lot of reading about psychology and behavioral economics and psychology of decision making, and thought that somebody should apply that to video games, and then decided that I was somebody. So I started up the website and started writing articles, and then a number of years later I pitched and sold a book called Getting Gamers, the Psychology of Video Games and Their Impact on the People Who Play Them, that you may be familiar with. And then shortly after the book came out, I started doing a podcast. And you can find all of that info over at psychologyofgames.com. So the first general question is, can you provide a brief description of the work that you do that's related to video games and how you came to be doing that work? So I just kind of described how I got into it. The brief description, I would say, is that I try to look at the overlap of psychology and video games, especially how psychology and psychological theory can be used to describe why gamers do what they do when we play, why games are designed so often the way they are, so why certain game design tropes work from a psychological perspective, and why games are marketed and sold as they are. So the one thing that you like and the one thing you dislike about your work, I like all of it. I think that when I started doing this back in 2009, it was not a particularly large field. There were definitely people doing work in the area, and I've gotten to see it grow, or if not grow, at least come more into the public consciousness and the consciousness of people in the games industry. So that's one thing I really enjoyed doing. The only thing that I dislike is, I'm not sure there's really anything that I dislike, other than I never seem to have enough time to do everything that I want to do, and write all the articles and interview all the peoples and write all the books that I want to do, especially with a day job on the side. Do you personally play video games is the third question. Absolutely yes. I was just playing a video game a few minutes ago. Follow-up question is, what is your favorite game of all time and why? What's the worst experience that you've had in a video game? Favorite game of all time and why? That's tough to pin down. Because my gaming life, I've been doing it since I was a kid, and it's kind of gone through so many different phases. Back in the early, like the mid to late 90s and the early 2000s, I was very much into the first-person shooter scene with Quake and Half-Life and Unreal Tournament, and all of those games that came out during those years. Counter-Strike, the early days thereof. Put a lot of time into those, put a lot of time into single-player role-playing games like Baldur's Gate and so forth. But I think if I had to pick my favorite game series of all times, it would probably be the Dark Souls series. I was just playing the Dark Souls remastered game on the PS4 earlier today. Just love the design, love the aesthetics, love how pure and simple and straightforward those games are, even if they are very punishing and difficult to get through in places. Worst experience I've had in a video game, I'm not sure I've ever really had any bad experiences. I'm pretty willing to bail on a game if I'm not having a good time with it within the first few hours. Had some bad sort of experiences with trolls and toxic people in games, just screaming and saying nasty things, which is probably a lot. A lot of you, if you've played online games, have probably encountered that as well. Does your professional work related to video games in some way interfere with your ability to enjoy games recreationally? Not really. I'd say the only thing there is that I like to try to play a lot of different kinds of games and a wide variety of games and a lot of games. I try to play all of the big AAA titles that come out. Not all, but as many as the ones that I like and could at least enjoy playing. And that doesn't leave me a lot of time to go real deep into competitive online games, for example. So, I'm not the kind of person that's going to dive deep into Battlefield or dive deep into Dota 2 or any of those MOBA type games. I might play them for a while just to get a hang of it, see what people are talking about, but that engagement with that game might last a few weeks instead of, for some people, like that's the game they play. That's all they play. And they get really good at it, and they get to know all the ins and outs. And kind of the approach that I take to what I do means that I try to see more of the gaming world than that, to look wide instead of really, really deep on any one given game. Next question is, what would you say is the most important way that video games have affected society? So that's kind of a broad question. It's kind of tough to answer, but I would say that the rise of multiplayer gaming and the way that games are so social in nature, and at least many of them, has been a big way that it's impacted society, and for the better, because a lot of the most successful games have online multiplayer components to it, and I was around to see that sort of happen, like in the mid to late 90s, like I mentioned, with the first-person shooter revolution and the birth of the MMOs, with Ultima Online and EverQuest and World of Warcraft. So I think that sort of having those shared social experiences and having video gaming be something that you don't necessarily have to do by yourself and on your own, those social experiences happening not only within the game world itself and within the game itself, playing with other people, making friends, making contacts, keeping track of each other, but also outside of it, with the growth of social media and sites like Reddit and having subreddits for every game and having fan pages and wikis for every game as well, to give people an additional ability to sort of get involved and interact with each other. Okay, so here's a loaded one. What's your opinion on the World Health Organization's ruling about identifying gaming, not ruling, but they're identifying gaming addiction as a disorder, or gaming disorder? And so the background on that is the World Health Organization is one of the organizations on worldwide scale that sets criteria for people diagnosing psychological disorders of various types. And so they have this large diagnostic manual that clinicians and therapists and other people working in that realm, mental health, can go and look and see sort of what characterizes mental disorders of various types. And they recently put in a gaming disorder, which essentially corresponds to overuse of video games. And what they don't ever use the word addiction, but it's included in the same section as things like alcohol and drug addiction. So they're kind of talking about addiction, but in the actual gaming disorder description, they never say the word addiction. But that's generally what's understood to be the context. And I know that gaming addiction probably exists. There are people out there who overuse and overdo it to the detriment of other parts of their life, sort of as the criteria describe. It's not too hard to go out there on Google or find news stories about people that played until they neglected their kids or neglected their school and work and had to, sort of have people have an intervention. But I think that the prevalence of that disorder is not very well known. And I think that pathologizing a normal behavior like playing video games will probably cause a lot of false positives now that these criteria are out there and sort of it's saying like, yeah, this is a thing. You can diagnose people with this. It's going to lead to a lot of false positives or people just assuming and self-diagnosing. A lot of therapists and other clinicians not necessarily knowing a lot about video games might point to these kinds of overuse of games and too much gaming as an addiction or as a problem. And one of the issues with that is that excessive gaming is often a coping mechanism. So it's something somebody does in response to another problem that they're having in their life, such as anxiety or depression, or just not enjoying their life very much, not being in a good place in their life. And that instead of focusing on those underlying problems of treating the anxiety or the depression or whatever it may be, that this gaming addiction gets labeled as the problem, and it's not very well understood. And I think that's probably one of the biggest problems that I have with this diagnosis or this standard, is that the research on it was really premature. There's not a very good understanding of what gaming addiction looks like, what leads to it, what are the triggers, how to treat it, those types of things, and that this inclusion by the WHO might have been kind of premature on their part. And there is a large potential for creating what's usually called like a moral panic, where video game and video game addiction are then serve as scapegoats for all kinds of things, and lots of pearl clutching and lots of concerned parents and other watchdog groups rushing in and saying that video games are evil, they're a problem, see, they cause addiction. This is the same kind of thing that we saw played out about video games in the 1990s when you were talking about violence in games. It was the same thing that was played about rock and roll music and television and Dungeons and Dragons and all these other types of things, all these other moral panics. It's sort of a well-worn script at this point. Question number 8. What challenge facing the game industry do you think is the most important one to solve? Probably something that I mentioned a little bit earlier. I would say that toxic behavior and poor sportsmanship in online games and online interactions in general is one of the biggest problems that I would like to see resolved. And this idea of how do you create environments where people are more likely to behave themselves and more likely to be good sports and minimize bad behavior and get along and just play the game. And how do you avoid creating environments where the opposite happens? And there's, if you've read the book, there's a whole chapter up front about that and about some of the good research that's happening by various psychologists and other researchers working in the games industries to try to combat that and deal with toxic behavior. And they're doing some good work, and it is a problem that I think everybody is interested in solving who works in the games industry, because nobody is out to create that kind of environment. Nobody is out to wallow in that kind of problem. They all want it solved to some degree, and any way that they can find. I'm not sure it's something that's going to be solved, that you're not going to have an environment that's open enough to call a video game or a community where you're not going to have some bad actors and you're not going to have some people wallowing in toxic behavior. But to what extent can we make it less of a problem and not the defining characteristic of our product, I think is a good question to answer and something good to take care of. Next question is, what change would you most like to see the industry make? I think the curbing toxic behavior is definitely one of them, but as an industry overall, I think that, and this kind of goes back to my industrial organizational psychology roots, is that I'd like to see the industry treat its employees better, and I'd like to see working in the gaming industry be better, and for those workplaces to be better. There's too much crunch time, there's too much people working really extended hours and being willing to do that and being pushed to do that because there's cultures in their organization and then in their industry that demand that they do it. And there are better ways to run a business, there's better ways to make games, there's better ways to make art, and finding out how to balance the needs of that marketplace with humane and reasonable treatment of employees and setting of expectations for work is definitely the problem that I would like to see the gaming industry solve. And it's kind of an interesting one, and it's may seem kind of lame because it really doesn't affect those of us who are outside of the industry, who are just playing the games that get made by the industry. But I think it's a really important problem for those that do work in it, and for the quality of the work that they do, and the fact that so many people who work in the gaming industry burn out and then go and work in other industries and other fields. They're like, well, I could make 3 times as much money making tax software with the same skill set, and I'll work half as many hours and have a life and be able to buy a house and start a family and live in different parts of the country. So a lot of that veteran talent and knowledge exits the industry because people get so burned out. Next question. What advice would you give to soon-to-be college graduates, some of whom may be listening, who might be interested in doing work that is connecting with the gaming industry? Well, I guess the first thing I would say is to make sure you want to do that. Give it everything that I just described. Do some due diligence and some work to talk to people who work in the industry, do some research to find out what you're getting into and how you might want to get out of it eventually, and make sure that you understand what it's like to work in that industry and sort of which companies are like that and which are not. Because there are some companies that do treat their employees well, and then there are some that are notorious for not doing so. But assuming that you do that and you are interested in working in the games industry, I'm not sure I have a whole lot of insight to offer there because I don't work in the games industry. I worked gaming industry adjacent for a few years back in the early 2000s when I worked for a company called GameSpy Industries that had GameSpy.com and some server browsing software, and I knew a lot of people that worked there, and then a lot of the people that I worked with there went on to go into the gaming industry, and I keep in touch with them. And the advice from them and from others that I keep seeing come up is that if you want to work in the gaming industry and you're trying to prepare to do that, like make something. So make something, build a portfolio, make mods for games, make game levels, make textures, make sounds. Just do that work, and if it's part of a class project or if it's something you're just doing on your own, write about games is good, but if you're wanting to work in the gaming industry, it's better, I think, to be able to say that you created that indie game, that simple game, the game that you use RPG Maker or some other game authoring tools like Unity or whatever, to actually create something and show. And it doesn't have to be great. What it has to do is show that you have the motivation to teach yourself how to do these or apply the lessons that you learned in class to make these kinds of things. And you have a portfolio of things to actually show when you go in for an interview or when you send in an application and have follow-ups with people. And it's best overall if you can have done something that shows you can collaborate with others. So if you worked on a mod with a group of people, if you worked on a project with a group of people, and you collaborated with somebody to create something, that is also a very important skill. Just like in most other industries, people in the gaming industry want those who are not only technically capable, but capable of working well with other people and getting along and collaborating. Because the days of one person making games in his or her basement and putting them in floppy disks and putting those disks in Ziploc baggies and selling them at the flea market or whatever are long gone. Any video game job is going to involve collaborating with others. So let's see. Next question is: what trends in the gaming industry do you anticipate, and how do you think your work will change because of that, if at all? So this is the part where people usually bring up something like virtual reality, VR rigs. I think VR is a dead end for gaming and entertainment in general. I think it's, at least in its current iteration, it's too expensive, it's too awkward, and it's not better than the alternatives. It's had a few years to sort of take hold in the gaming industry, and it's simply not done that, despite best efforts of even organizations like Sony and Facebook out there with lots of money to throw around and trying to get this hardware out there. If we do see VR happen as a trend in gaming, it'll come because there's been a revolution in the hardware. But even then, I wouldn't bet on it personally. Other trends, I think you're going to continue to see expansion for casual and mobile markets. Expansion of what is considered a video game by people by and large in the culture. I think that market's going to continue to expand, and you're going to have a lot of people just want to casually engage with games, and they don't want to sit and play a 45-minute to 60-minute game of Dota 2 or League of Legends. They're going to want to play like a 40-second round of something on their phone, which you already have that, and it's already a wildly successful market. It's going to continue to be so. I think you're going to continue to see the trends of social elements in games, communities around games, and game developers building social aspects into their game. Kind of the one real pie in the sky trend that I sort of see on the horizon and see people talking about, and I hope really takes off, would be artificial intelligence in games. You open up a lot of really interesting possibilities when you have truly something like true artificial intelligence, or what we think of as true artificial intelligence, where games can adapt and fork narratives and customize game experiences based on what they're seeing the player do, what they understand about the player. And you're seeing that kind of technology develop in other areas, especially around social media, marketing, big data, use of that. And to the extent that could then make its way into video games, I think could create some really fascinating experiences and some really fascinating possibilities. And it could be the next big thing, after online and some of the other revolutions that have happened in the gaming industry. Number 12, what do you think distinguishes a successful game from an unsuccessful one? I guess it's really just sales, right? I mean, revenue, how much money they make, and how much profit probably they make specifically. I'm not really a game designer, so I can't really say anything beyond that, but that seems like the obvious answer to this question. Maybe it was trying to get more around like what qualities of a game lead to success, and I think there's a lot of different ways that you can answer that question, and a lot of different ways that games could be successful. I think that what you're seeing lately is a lot of games try to become very sticky. By that meaning that they want players to come back regularly, and they don't want them to be done with the game and sell it back to GameSpot or to a friend or throw it in a drawer and be done with it. So this whole games as a service concept where where developers make games that people want to keep coming back to, and they keep adding content and adding additional features to the game. That if you can nail that, then you're probably going to have a successful product if the game is good and if it's interesting. So let's see. Next question. So these are more specific questions. What is the most important idea about the gaming industry that you hope readers take away from your book? What misconceptions about the gaming industry that you had hoped to change while writing your book? So we're talking about this book here. I think the biggest misconception or lesson that I wanted people to walk away with after reading the book was that good gaming experiences can be engineered with the help of psychology. And they don't happen by accident, and they don't happen simply because somebody sort of knows what makes for a good game or entertaining game, or they know how to make something fun. That you can use psychology in related fields to actually understand what it is that people want out of games, what motivates them to play, what keeps them playing, what makes them interact well with others, and you can take these lessons and really engineer, and I think that is the right word, and to build those good gaming experiences and those effective games. And not only that, but that people are doing that, right? That there are people working in the industry and they're trying to make games better through the use of their expertise in psychology and data analysis and communications and all those different types of things, and that sort of thing is possible and has a good place in it. User experience design and user interface design and computer-human interactions is a neighboring field as well that I didn't specifically talk a whole lot about on the book because there's tons of other books out there on those topics, but that's definitely part of it as well. As far as like one of the misconceptions that I wanted to change is related to this point is that psychology, the use of psychology in video games is not always in service of sort of screwing the customer over. That they're not just trying to wring a few more dollars out of you, although some of them are. But you need to be able to come at that in your own terms and understand what's going on. But in addition to when that happens, there's also a lot of other people in the gaming industry using these just to try to make better games and more enjoyable experiences and simpler interfaces and better games, better gaming experiences for you and me. Next question is, you got involved with game development companies to discuss how psychology of games can be implemented into gameplay. What are some of the reasons a company desires to get outside help? the same reason that they would hire any other consultant typically is that they lack the in-house expertise and they need to bring somebody in. That's probably the most common answer. That they might say, like, okay, we know something's going on here, we don't understand what our players are doing, or we don't understand how to design an experience to get them to do what we want, or we want to evaluate what they're doing, and we don't have anybody on staff who can do that, so they might bring in somebody who is an expert in those areas, bring in a consultant. A lot of times, along with that, they just want an outside opinion. So people working on the game who are very close to it, very close to the project, don't necessarily always have the distance needed to sort of look at everything as a whole and offer an informed opinion to give them an answer to a specific question. And then other times they may just want somebody like myself or anybody else in this area to come in and just sort of summarize like what's known about a particular topic. Like, what do we know about toxic behavior in games? What do we know about developing systems to get people to log in every day? What do we know about this topic or that topic? And so they might hire a consultant to come in and just provide an overview of that, and that might generate some ideas or some hypotheses, some things to play around with in A/B testing or what have you. Next question. What stage in game development is most important to consider the psychology of the player? As with most things, I would say earlier the better, as early as possible. That you want to start understanding what sorts of experiences you have and what fundamental things you can be doing in your game to develop around those. Although it is sometimes useful to do postmortems as well, where you come in after a project is completed and look at it and try to figure out either what went wrong or what went well, or just what went and what happened. And I actually can say these types of things, but with the games as a service model that I mentioned earlier, this question sort of becomes more or less and less relevant, right? Because there's very, very rarely like a beginning of a project or an end of a project. It's just sort of an ongoing thing. So, somebody might be brought in, or questions around the psychology of games might be asked at any point, or around any milestone. People could be brought in to address these kinds of questions. Number 4, when you travel to PAX, or I will add other conventions like that, what kinds of topics do people who approach you, what are they curious about? For like PAX, which I went to PAX West in Seattle for the first time earlier this year, and had a great time, and mostly people who came up and talked to us afterwards were just interested in the topic of the panel. So, excuse me, we're interested in talking about the gaming disorder from the WHO. They were interested in talking about psychology of this or that or whatever we were talking about, and they would have very specific questions about that. But that was a different kind of audience. That those were all gamers for the most part. So those were consumers, people that played games. A lot of people as well who worked in the gaming industry, who might make games or work in that industry in other ways. You get qualitatively different kinds of questions and interests in more open or different kinds of events, so like outside of PAX, less sort of gaming focused events. For example, when the book first came out, or shortly after, like within the first year, I was invited to go to a book festival up in Vermont, I think, somewhere in New England. I can't remember exactly. But it was just a book festival, and it was a bunch of new books, and they had panels where they would group people together, sort of people had books on similar topics. So I was grouped with a guy named Greg Topo, who's a reporter for USA Today and had written a book about the use of video games in education and psychology related to that. And so Greg and I were on this panel just kind of talking about our books and, psychology in video games and education in video games. And there were a lot of parents who came to these types of events, and all they wanted to talk about were the big hot button topics around, are violence in video games bad for my kid? Is it gonna warp them? My kid is playing too much Minecraft at that time, if I did this again today, I'm sure they'd be talking about Fortnite or Roblox or whatever it is. But my kids are playing too much games. They're addicted. I can't get them to come out and work in the wood shop with me, or I can't get them to go fly fishing with me, or whatever it is. And so those hot topic buttons were much more prevalent when you get outside of the gaming industry. And it is what people want to talk about. And I do frequently get questions from reporters via email who just found me on the web or heard about the book or whatever and want to ask about these types of things. And education as well, to Greg's credit as well. That tends to be one of the other hot button topics that people are really interested in, and it's not as negatively slanted as addiction or violence in games. They want to talk about the use of video games in education. Like how can I use video games to make my kid better at math or learn geography or whatever it is. What's the unhealthiest habit in games right now? I'm not sure I can make a blanket proclamation on this. That seems like a really broad question to ask and kind of a loaded question. So maybe I'll narrow it down a little bit and say, one of the more problematic topics or habits in games, things that I see game developers doing a lot more of these days, is loot boxes. So creating loot boxes, and if you don't know, a loot box would be like a treasure chest that you earn in game. And you open it up and you get usually cosmetic items, so like maybe a new outfit for your character or a new gun or a new decal for your player icon or whatever. Although they can also include game-changing features as well, so power-ups or consumables that you could use while you're playing the game. Some that might even give you a competitive over other games, and some few games have done that. And you can earn these loot boxes, and everything's random, by the way. So when you open up the box, it's like pulling a lever on a slot machine, and you get something at random. And you never know what you're going to get. It might be ordinary, it might be next to worthless, or it might be super awesome. You just never know. And so you can earn these in-game, or a lot of games offer the option for you to pay real money to buy them. So, if I want to get 3 loot boxes, I can give you $5. Of real money, or buy virtual currency, $5 worth, and then give you that virtual currency, which amounts to the same thing. This is talk about your hot button topics. This is becoming a real big issue, and it's getting a lot of attention both inside and outside of the gaming industry because it's been labeled as gambling. It's been described as gambling, and people feel like it's gambling. And there has been a lot of discussion about should games that feature these types of things be subject to the same laws that gambling games, websites, and institutions are. So I think that's a really tricky habit that the gaming industry needs to self-regulate on and solve. Or you're going to see the government in the U.S. and in other places around the world step in to kind of take over that monitoring and dealing with that problem. It is definitely getting a lot of attention, and personally, I don't typically like loot boxes, especially if it feels like the game is geared towards balancing it in a way so that you want or need to buy loot boxes to enjoy the game or get ahead in the game. If there's a lot of other players who have stuff that it looks like they've gotten through loot boxes, even if that's not the case, if the perception is there, it sort of sours the experience. And there's actually been research done on envy and these kinds of things and microtransactions and so forth. So I don't enjoy them. I tend to disengage from games that feature that kind of thing once I feel that I've gotten what I'm going to get out of it, and I'll move on instead of engaging with any kind of loot box or microtransaction exchanges where you have to buy those types of experiences. So number 6, next question. Some of the statistics in your textbook seem to be unrepresentative of the larger population. Obviously, while gaming has not been around for as long, to do great in-depth longitudinal studies, actually has. I mean, gaming's been around for decades at this point. But the question continues, do you plan on editing or revising your textbook in order to create more representative data in the future? If so, how would you go about collecting this data so that there's no misinformation? It's a pretty good question. I don't have any plans to do another version of the book or an updated version of the book. That would really be a call on the editor or the publisher's part. If they were interested in doing that, I would certainly talk to them about creating an updated edition of that. But large part of the answer to this question is why I created psychologygames.com and why I continue to update that website. So the book is sort of frozen in time, not even when it was released, but I sent the manuscript to the publisher months before it was even available to buy. And in that time, stuff happens, and references get outdated, and there's additional research that's published or made available. So that's why I always try to keep that sort of stuff going on psychologyofgames.com. And my dog is about to bark because there's somebody at the door. Yep, that was Amazon.com delivering something, which I'm normally happy to see them leave something out the door, but timing in this case is not great. So anyway, that was the reason I created psychologygames.com, so I could continue to publish updates about what's happening in the world of psychology and video games. And you can always go there, and it's why I started doing the podcast as well, so I could continue to talk about people working in this area and keep new information going. The outdated reference in the game about games in the books is a tougher problem to solve. There'll be references there to games that are years old and that nobody may remember. Although I tried to kind of keep it current by talking about franchises that are likely to keep going, like Diablo and Medal of Honor and Battlefield and all of that kind of thing. But then like Fortnite came out of nowhere, for example, and I never mentioned Fortnite in the book because even if it existed, it was in its previous incarnation and not the phenomenon that it was. But that's just, life with writing books instead of stuff on the web. Can't really go back and update it. People don't really go back and update stuff on the web either. Next question is, was it hard to find definitive professional research while writing the book? In your opinion, is there a lot of reputable research about gaming out there? That's true. There is reputable research about gaming out there. There's more and more of it every month. I think that's being published, and you're seeing a lot of research about psychology and video games show up in very august and very impressive publications like Journal of Applied Psychology and Psychological Bulletin, Nature, etc. And you're starting to see more and more of it around these big picture type of stuff. So I made use of that where I could, and it was easy enough to find today on the internet, and the access that I had to the research, pulling from books and from refereed journals. There was a lot of it, though, that was a lot more basic than that relied on just general things from psychology and general studies about psychology, because that was one of the things that I try to do, is show that, yeah, it's great when you have research that's specifically about video games and that medium, but look, all this other stuff that we know about human behavior in other contexts, in other media, and other organizations, and other situations can be fruitfully applied to understanding video games as well. And so I did a lot of that in the book, continue to do a lot of that as well. So there is a lot of high quality stuff. There's also a lot of low quality stuff out there as well, and part of the training that you go through as a student is to learn to tell the difference and figure out who can you listen to and what are the red flags of bad research, more likely what are the red flags of people trying to overgeneralize from research and trying to draw larger conclusions from a very small study, or even something just like a survey that they had done. So next question is, were there any topics you left out of the textbook because you didn't think they were accurately researched at the time? Not really. I never came across something that I felt like I wanted to include, but there wasn't enough good research to include it. Although I would say that the lack of a chapter about the question of addiction and overuse of games is kind of glaring in hindsight, and especially now, given everything that I just talked about with loot boxes and such, that seems like a chapter that should be in there, and it is. I do wish that there were an additional chapter in there. I think that would have made a good addition. Next question is, what do you think of more manipulative game models like microtransactions, such as Japanese gacha games, and how do you see those models expanding or evolving? I talked about this a little bit before, so you can kind of see those earlier comments. I'm not a fan of in-app purchases, IAPs, microtransactions, whatever label you want to call, buying stuff within the game. Occasionally it can work if a game is free or cheap, and I think it's a good way to support the developer. But I really hate seeing it show up in full-priced or almost full-price games, because it usually leaves the question of, like, was the game designed around this or not, or is this just something extra? I think it's generally bad optics, as they say too. See my previous comments about loot boxes and microtransactions, and the gaming industry needs to sort of self-correct. And then the next question, actually it looks like I already answered as well. Getting Gamers was published 3 years ago. If you could add a chapter to the book now, what would you write to best fit the development of the gaming industry? Definitely something, maybe 2 chapters, one about addiction, or at least the idea of it, and what is on the horizon there, and is overuse of gaming a problem? How prevalent is it? And then some of the stuff around loot boxes would have figured in much more heavily if I were writing the book today, or writing an updated version of it. So I probably have already answered those questions as well. So that's all the questions that I have. I hope you found this interesting and enjoyable, and I appreciate that you all are reading the book, even if you're being made to and forced to by your professor. But I do hope that you find some interesting stuff about it. If you do, if you want more, like I mentioned, you can go to psychologygames.com, find literally hundreds of articles that I've written there. You can search through the archives. There's dozens of episodes of the podcast as well that you can check out. And if you have follow-up questions, or if you're curious about anything, or want more information, I would invite you to feel free to email me at Jamie, Jamie, at psychologygames.com. Love getting emails like that from people with questions and readers, so feel free to do that, and I'll do my best to answer. That's it, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.